morning, good afternoon, or even good evening, our dear teachers, and welcome to our first winter podcast. As you see, we've been changed our decoration, so just like to create some specific special atmosphere. So my name is Catherine Osso, and I'm going to host our meeting today. And we all are, I believe, international teachers here, and we all know how challenging it might be when it comes to cultures. So today, our guests are Gary Smith, a TTC expert, and Marina Evstratova, the head of methodology in DTC. And we are here to talk about the way cultural differences can affect the teach and learning process and how to deal with it. So glad to see you. How are you today, our dear experts? Marina? Oh, there is something happened with the connection. So Gary, how are you today?
First of all, I'm doing absolutely fantastic today, especially after the small drizzle that we had yesterday. So I can't be better. And just generally, I'm doing quite well. Not actually quite well, wonderfully well. And thank you for having me.
So good. Marina, you are here again. How are you today? How is your connection?
I'm assuming that you're asking how we're doing, right?
Yes.
I'm having troubles with my connection, so. Okay, but so far so good. It's minus 20 outside, maybe a surprise for some people who are living in warm areas. But yeah, Gary, don't be so surprised.
Yeah.
It's
Siberia,
28 here.
What? 28.
Plus.
Yeah, currently it's 28, yeah.
Oh my
Not
God.
negative, I mean just plain 28. Yesterday was 38, so that's what I meant. Just wow.
Ooh,
Such a difference we have. Actually, here in my city, it's also minus 20
I'm
today.
jealous.
Yeah, that's why I cannot send Marina. Yeah, so you see, and differences, yeah. So,
Cultural
but
differences.
today we're not gonna talk about weather differences, but about cultural differences. So, Gary, I'd like to ask you first. What do you think about the role of cultural difference in class? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where cultural differences would severely affect how your lesson went on?
That is a spectacular question, and I'd have to say yes. To the first question about the role of the cultural differences, culture basically forms the lens through which students see everything. And it's our job as teachers to kind of adapt into that atmosphere to make sure that what we teach adapts to their lens as well, while still giving them the biggest benefit that we can. And I've had two main extremes. So I was an in person teacher before all of this. And well, the biggest thing that I saw was, especially with the very young students that had never been exposed to, say, a foreign teacher if you're in a different country, they use culture and rely on culture in every way, shape, or form that they can, whenever it is they're experiencing a lesson of some sort. And then you see it at the other extremes as well, where you have the adult, for example, especially the older adults that might want to learn English or another language, and because they have the culture so ingrained into them, the culture is very, very apparent there as well. So that's going to be my answer here, at least.
Okay, such an extended answer then. Thank you. Marina, what about you? What is your opinion on that?
Well, at first I'm back.
Welcome.
Surprise, good.
I was away for a second because of my connection. Um, yeah, when talking about cultural differences, I think that most of the time we have some negative connotation to it. We imply that, well, if we have cultural differences, we are going to have some troubles because of it. But I don't know, in my practice, I've never had any extremes or maybe I just didn't have any extensive practice teaching someone from other countries. Of course, I had some practice, especially at the very beginning of my teaching career, so to say. But I wouldn't say that I had any negative experience. What I can say is that, different cultures, or just people coming from different learning environment, it might not be connected to a culture specifically, have different learning styles, different beliefs about studying, different opinions about the role of a teacher in a classroom or a student in a classroom that might affect the way you teach, and you would need to bear that in mind. So basically, this is what I think about that.
Okay, Marina, thank you. And actually, like mostly you talked about some differences in general, yeah. But actually, we all are different.
Yeah.
But I guess that in the context of language classroom, it might be some specific, some particular things to pay attention to. Can you just like give some more details about that, Marina? What can you say?
Mm, well, it depends on which context we're talking about. But for example, I've read the article that was based on the research project, and the whole research project was about foreign professors talking about their experience working with Russian students, Russian speaking students. And well, basically, there were several points that I vividly remember. For example, saying that Russian speaking students are not as proactive as, for example, European students, if you're comparing these two cultures, so to say, European culture in general, into any particular country in Russia. And well, the role of a teacher in a classroom differs immensely as well. Might be open
Mhm. Yeah. So as I
for
said,
Russian speaking.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
You lost me as well.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We've heard that people might be open.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. So you didn't lose me then. Yep.
Okay. So anyway, I see there are some problems with connection still. So anyway,
Some
Marina.
in terms of this research, that's hilarious. Again.
No, you know, we are talking about differences today. So differences not only in cultures but in internet connection too. That's why that's okay. Just don't worry.
Yeah.
So you can
Yep.
continue. I hope now, as I see, your connection is green. Yeah, that's why we can go on.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Marina, can you hear us? We
Yeah.
can.
Marina?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we can
Uh-huh.
hear
Can
you.
you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I'm
That's
just afraid that you're going to lose me in a second again. What I was talking about for the third time was group work. I'm just going
okay.
to lash out the keywords: group work, productivity, the main differences. Yep. Regarding group work, for example, there was a very interesting point saying that Russian speaking students coming from our environment are not students just because they are like are they are seeing the teacher as the main person in the classroom. And
Mm-hmm.
I would hear lots of students saying that, well, if I communicate with my classmates or group mates, I'm not going to learn anything from them because, well, they're also students, classmates, whatever. They are not teachers. They don't possess any knowledge that I don't possess as well. And the only
Mm.
resource of knowledge is the teacher, for example. But again, not in all of the cultures has the same role, and it affects the way how the teacher. In our culture has a more authoritative role.
Mm-hmm.
Cultures
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Marina, thank you so much for this
as well.
information.
Internet
And
connection.
now,
So Gary,
yeah,
over to you.
yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I'm gonna ask Gary actually. Gary, have you ever observed anything that Marina has just mentioned? That the role of the teacher, the productivity, etc.
Actually, I have. It was one of the first things that I actually saw when I moved from, say, well, my country specific teaching experience to something like Eastern Asians and Russians. For example, it's about how the culture sees themselves as well. For example, individualists or as group thinkers, for example, and especially in my culture, for example, like Marina said, the students are very, very proactive.
Mm-hmm.
They'll talk to each other, they'll talk to to the teacher, for example, and it's a very interesting dynamic they have. Whereas, especially if you have a look at Eastern Asia, there, it's almost as if the teacher is the be all end all. Whatever the teacher says, that's something they have to listen to exactly. Even if a teacher makes a mistake and the students know it's a mistake, they'll try and adopt the teacher's method of reasoning, for example. And it's very, very interesting. And the same can be rather said for Russian students as well, based on what I've seen, in that Russian students would rather listen first and then maybe perhaps at the end or so, they'll share their own opinion or something as well. Once they get really, really comfortable with the teacher and the way that the students interact with said teacher. So, yeah, that would be my own personal experience here.
So you really could see that, yeah? The same information which Marina has just told us.
It's very, very apparent, so to say. For example, at one point I had to teach an international class, for example, where I'm used to bouncing ideas off of students, for example. And when I tried to do that, I was just met with silent stares. That was incredibly jarring as someone who's used to interacting with, say, the students as well, and as much as I normally did. And it was quite an adaptation to try and bring in certain elements of that while still adhering to their own culture as well. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Gary, for this information. And now then, we've discussed the situation, yeah, like how it works, yeah. But what about not the theory? What about some practical pieces of advice? What tips can you give us, or maybe tools even, yeah, to take everything we've mentioned into account? Marina, what tips can you give us?
First and foremost, I would say that whenever whenever you have a new student from a different learning environment, the first thing that you would need to do is to try to analyze which learning environment the student came from. And if you don't have this opportunity, you would need to ask a student. And well, this is the thing that lots of teachers are afraid to, for different reasons. Teachers are afraid that it's going to expose some way professionally that the student might think that they're not professionals or whatever. But asking about the way the student would like to be taught is a very important thing here. Some students are not ready to be corrected. Some students are not ready to see a teacher in a particular role in a classroom, and it's really necessary to clarify that from the very beginning, just because when you start, for a student, it might be really, really hard to say that the student feels uncomfortable. And well, learning environment that the student came from, and not being ready to correct the teacher, for instance. So the deeper needs analysis at the very beginning would be the first thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Deeper analysis. Okay, so let's write it down somewhere, yeah, not to forget. And Gary, what about your tips?
Well, mine is slightly different compared to Marina's here. And it's just personally my own style of how I like to approach things as well. So, for example, Marina focused on the needs analysis where they ask the individual students. In my case, I like to, it's not really correct, but I like to be more general in that. And then based on individual classes, narrow it down. Because for some weird reason, it might just be my luck or so, but I found that similar students and similar learning styles, for example, are grouped together quite often. So 99% of the time, it will be the case. But if, as long as you have a grand idea, a global idea of how the culture approaches it, for example, and how the individual schools, for example, approach things, then it's much easier to find out where you fit in that entire picture. And one of the biggest things that I'd say then is it's not really important as so much as how you start, for example, because you will get students that are, not ready to be corrected, like Marina said here. And in those cases, you just need to make sure how people perceive a teacher, especially in that culture, for example. What example can I draw on here? Okay, I had this one student, for example, back when I was abroad in China. And the student was incredibly well off in English. He had no problems whatsoever. But he refused to be corrected because it was almost like it tainted his honor in a certain way, for example. And in that case, there's a certain way that you need to approach that that is dependent on the culture as well. So I'd say try and find a bigger picture of a culture, how teachers are seen, how you should fit into it, and how they normally interact with not only their peers, but also their teachers and even parents in this case. So that's going to be my rather rough answer in this case. So yeah.
Okay, Marina, what can you tell us about Gary's tip? Is it okay to use and try to implement them into our practice at Skyeng, like with our individual students?
Well, I can't agree more actually, because in this case, well, not I would only say that not all teachers would have this opportunity to, well, probably it's not an opportunity, but would have the tool or maybe skill to analyze the culture from the correct perspective. Because when we're looking at, I don't know, some learning environment, we might not know where to start and how exactly we're going to find our place in it, because we don't know what features we would need to analyze. For example, we're mentioning all of that here. For example, the role of the teacher, the role of the student, being ready to interact. The value of the subject itself might also be very important to analyze, because for some people, knowing the language is extremely important. It's essential, and they're going to do anything that their teacher is going to say. But for some people, it's just going to be, I don't know, a side activity, right? And they're going to perceive it in a different way. Sometimes, of course, it's not connected with any cultural differences whatsoever, but it might as well if, for example, it's the part of the studies. And yeah, I guess that it's a two-sided approach. First, you're going to analyze the general context, and if you lack some information, and if you didn't find some information in that, you're going to, of course, discuss it with the student, and well, your teaching style to what your student is ready for.
Okay, Marina, thank you. Thank you for this answer. And now, I'd like to hear from you some practical pieces of advice too. I mean, like how you use that. For example, I don't know, Gary, have you ever had this experience with our students? I don't know, maybe in talks or some your lessons here at Skyeng. Can you give us some specific examples?
That is a very nice question here. And I'd like to draw upon two particular ones, for example. One was more recent, and the other one was in the beginning when I just started, where I had this university level student, and he did incredibly well with his English, for example. But in that case, I wasn't really sure where I should fit in, how I should, for example, help the student as well. And I was very, very lucky that he was a bit more proactive than the normal students. I was able to bounce some ideas, not off of him, but off the way that he studied, for example. So whenever I would correct him, he would be very, very intrigued and asking me, okay, why exactly is this the case? Why, for example, do we have to use the ing form here, for example? And as such, and I found that it would be a very good idea, at least in this particular situation, where you find those students that are not over eager, that are extremely eager to bounce some of the other ideas of it you wanted to try, for example, but weren't really able to, and then see how they react to it. Because these outliers are not really good to test things, but they're a lot more open in some cases, especially if it's someone that's very, very eager. Because this student in particular wanted to get a proper result so he can go and study in America. So he was a lot more open to the things and the way that I used to do things, for example. And then rather recent, I found someone a lot more traditional, and I was able to see some of the things that I'd normally done, for example, would not really work with this particular student. And one of which is being not really eager to correct, but leaving things until later to correct, for example, where you need to find a careful balance, for example, for when you need to correct someone, especially in oral English, and how often you do that. So the bigger things, for example, that need a lot more explanation, I would say you should keep in until the end of their speech, for example. Let's say they have a uh, prepared speech, for example. I'd make notes of the bigger things and leave it for the end. Whereas, let's say it's a pronunciation issue where they have what is a common one I can draw upon? My mind's blank currently. But let's say that it's a pronunciation issue or something small that they have trouble with right in the middle of it. I'd say that those are often better to correct in the middle of it if the student is open for that. But especially for more traditional students, it's not really accurate to do that because that will damage their confidence, especially if they're not used to the more interesting dynamic that foreign teachers have. So, in this particular situation, you need to know exactly who it is that you are, well, let's say teaching in this particular case, but you also need to make sure how ready the student is for it. And you can only do that by throwing in small things. Let's say the student mispronounces box. I'm not sure how they'll mispronounce box, but I mean, they'll mispronounce box. And it's something simple, for example, that you can just wait until they have a brief moment, box, and see how they react to that, for example. My approach to teaching general is just a blind man in a bar. That's the best example I can give you. Test as much as you can and try and determine where the student will be in said bar, for example. The students that want to go out to America or Britain or Australia to go and study, for example, they'll be much more open to you just doing things like how you're used to. And you can normally test that as well, and then see how they respond to that. And at the end, for example, give them reason as to why you did these things. So I've been in Australia for 20 years or so, and this is the way that we do things. And what I just did was a good example of how you would do that. You can give that as a reason, for example. Whereas the more traditional students, you really never know what you can get. I had one very, very traditional student that didn't want to be corrected at all, like Marina said at one point. And then yesterday, actually, there was one student that was still traditional but wanted to be corrected at one point, but then there's the accurate balance of overcorrection and undercorrection and whatnot. It's a very, very difficult concept, actually. And the best thing I can say is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. So, yeah, I'm
But
rambling. Apologies.
have you ever had the situation where, for example, yeah, there was a really traditional student and he just like refused. He said, "No, no, no, just let's follow my instructions. Please do it like I want. I've got used to that. Teach me like that."
Well, none that traditional, at least not on Skyrim. But I have had one of those teachers where one of my previous managers brought me a bit closer, into their office. Like, okay, Gary, this student is incredibly traditional. They prefer to do things that way. So I have had a similar kind of experience, but not really in Skyrim, no. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And just like about your observation, does it matter what age your student is? Like, was it about teenagers or adults or senior learners? Uh-huh.
Yes, yeah, yeah. That is another wonderful question here. So I found that generally, the older a student is, the more set in their ways they're going to be. So let's say the student is 40 or 50 years old, then the culture is already ingrained into them, and in that case, you have to be careful in how you approach them. You can't really experiment as much as you would want to. Whereas for younger students, culture is important to them, but not so much as the things that go on around them, for example. So I'd say that for the younger students, it's much easier to try and find out what works and what won't work compared to the older students where they already have a tried and tested approach that they rather follow. And that is mainly dependent on the culture that they've experienced and whether it's individualist or collectivist. So, yeah.
So, yeah, we should really think about our style of teaching when we see how old our student is. Yeah, and be ready for everything, I suppose. So, our time is almost up. We have just some minutes left. Marina, can you give us like the final, very short tip? What all international teachers should use when we see that our student is from another culture, from another country?
I guess that my tip would be a summary of what Carrie just said,
Yeah, let's start.
saving me from the internet connection troubles. I guess that the main point, well, two main points would be being ready to adapt. It doesn't matter how many years you've spent teaching in some particular way, and it doesn't matter that your methods, for example, or your tips and tricks always work in some particular environment. With a new student from a different culture, from a different learning environment, it might not work, and you must be ready for that. You must be ready to adapt. Uh, and yeah, that's the main point. And adapting would concern different features, from teacher's role to the style of teaching that you follow. And I guess the second point here would be being ready to share some cultural differences or differences in learning environments, because this would be the way you and your student actually are going to understand why exactly you're different, how you're different, and why you as a teacher, why you're doing some things you're doing in the classroom. For some students, for example, it might not be understandable why exactly you're behaving in a particular way in a classroom, why you have this role, for instance, or why you think that some things are important in the class, why group work works or doesn't work, for example, if you're teaching groups. And for students as well, it's going to be quite interesting to get to know you a little bit better. So being open to new students and new environments as well is a good way to research everything that's around you.
Yeah, I suppose because while we're teaching, we also study something new. Yeah, we also learn some
True.
information. It's really useful and interesting. So, Marina, Gary, thank you so much for your tips, for the information you have just given us. So, dear teachers, our time is unfortunately up. And we are about to finish our meeting. In the chat, you can find the link. We will be really glad if you fill out this feedback form, because your opinions are very important for us and we take them into account, choosing the next topics. Yeah. So just kindly remind you that in 2 weeks we are going to meet again and we are going to discuss even, I suppose, hotter topics, yeah, which will be really useful for you. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your information, which our experts given us. Thank you for you. And thank you our listeners for your comments, for your hellos. Yes, so have a good time today. Hope that the weather will be not bad. Yeah, and you will be really glad to see any types of the weather. So have a nice time then and see you really soon in 2 weeks. Bye bye.
Bye bye then.